So I've received this question a few times in about the last month and a half from various people. I believe it's because there are some articles floating around the internet on social media about Jesus and the early Christians all being vegetarians. This comes from two different passages found in the letters of Paul. The first being Romans chapter 14 and the second being 1 Corinthians chapter 8. And in these, there's this discussion concerning proper dietary practices of early Christians. Some Christians are, judging other Christians for eating meat. And because of this, people have said, this shows that early Christians, and maybe even Christ himself, were all vegetarians, and so modern people should be vegetarians because of these passages. But that's not actually what the text is talking about. If you actually read Romans 14 and 1 Corinthians 8, you see that this is an argument that Paul is trying to reconcile. And what this argument is about isn't really about the meat. It is about pagan sacrifice. In the ancient world, a lot of meat came from temples. What would happen is you would have an animal, like a goat or a sheep or a pig, that would be taken to a temple and sacrificed. And this would be an offering to their gods. And a certain, a small portion of the animal would then be removed from the animal, cooked, and eaten by the temple priests. And that would conclude this offering. Now, what do you do with the rest of the animal? Well, you sell it. And so they would sell it to, a meat market, a vendor. And this animal would then be diced up and sold to people on the street who would come by and, purchase their groceries. And this is how temples would, recoup some of the money that they spent on these animals to make these sacrifices. So this meat may not be sacrificed to Yahweh. This may be meat sacrificed to a pagan god, because most Christians in the early church lived outside of Israel. They were living in places like Turkey and Egypt and Greece and Rome. These places had temples devoted to all sorts of different deities, hundreds of different gods, and each of these temples was making these sacrifices and then selling the meat to a meat market that would then go on and sell it to whoever came by, Christians included. And you didn't always know where your meat came from. It didn't have a tag that said, certified kosher. It just was a thing of meat. So if you bought a steak, you might be buying a pagan steak, something that was offered to, Dionysus or Mithra or whomever. So is it okay to eat pagan meat? Well, that's the question that is being put to Paul. There are members of his congregation in Rome and in Corinth who were saying, look, some of the people here are eating meat that they just bought from the market, and they don't know where this meat came from. It could be meat sacrificed to a pagan god. So they're sinning because they are eating pagan meat. And Paul goes on in Romans 8 to basically say that you shouldn't be judging your fellow Christians for eating whatever they feel like eating or eating whatever they can afford. That's another topic in his letters is, the difference between the rich Christians and the poor Christians. And there's some conflict between them. And he's saying to basically leave them alone. And he also says that nothing in and of itself is unclean. And so pagan meat is not, by its nature, unclean, and therefore it is not, sinful to eat it. And he said it's judging people for eating it that makes one unclean. He goes into more detail on this in 1 Corinthians 8, where he says that essentially, since these other gods don't exist, their magic can't influence the meat from the sacrifice, so it's just basic meat, regardless of who it's sacrificed to, because those gods don't exist. And so, if you eat a cow that was sacrificed, to this random god in some other city, it doesn't matter, because those people were fools to sacrifice to a god that doesn't exist. And that power doesn't exist to influence the meat, therefore it's just regular meat. And so this kind of puts the whole argument to rest. Now, back to the vegetarian thing. There's no indication in there at all that this is a prohibition against meat in general. It's specifically about meat that has been offered to a pagan god in a pagan temple as part of a pagan sacrifice. And it says nothing about meat in general. And nowhere in it does he even prohibit the eating of pagan meat, let alone all meat. He just says it's not unclean, so it doesn't matter if you eat it. So obviously, he's not talking to people who are vegetarians, and he's not addressing the idea of being a vegetarian. He's addressing the idea of eating meat that has been sacrificed to pagan gods. We also have the scene with the Last Supper. And in the Last Supper, you have the sacrificial lamb that is then cut up and eaten by all the disciples and Jesus himself. And so I find it difficult to make an argument that Jesus is considered to be a vegetarian if he is eating lamb as part of a communal meal. I think that right there kind of precludes one from being vegetarian. I mean, vegetarian means you don't eat meat, and we have a scene of Jesus eating meat. So, no, there's no evidence that, at least in the scriptures, that early Christians were vegetarian. That's taking two different verses that are about pagan sacrifice out of context and trying to add a modern view on these. Now, there would have been vegetarian Christians. We do have some Buddhist influence in the region at the time. We also have some evidence that parts of the Sermon on the Mount reference Buddhist scripture, and this could have been, some of this influence from Buddhism. And so, since Christianity was a sort of a giant casserole of different ingredients, you would have had some Christians that were vegetarian, but we don't have any scriptural basis in the Bible that says that Christians had to be vegetarian, whether back then or today. That's just taking a couple of passages out of context and trying to read into them a meaning that simply isn't there.